Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. My name is Dr. Melanie Jackson at Melanie the Midwife. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD. Our Great Birth Rebellion premium members also get access to podcast transcripts, additional resources, the Ask Mel a Question button, and an exclusive monthly Ask Me Anything episode. That said, let's get into it. All right, let's do it, Sarah. One more. Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion. I am still here with Sarah Smits, and we've been speaking for the last 3 episodes. This is the 3rd episode about her work, global midwife. And today we're going to tap into her knowledge on belly binding. But a bit of a fun fact is that, I like to look at the research on certain things, and my physiotherapist helped me with belly binding during my 2nd pregnancy because I had diastasis recti, which is like when your abdominal muscles sort of disappear to the sides and leave you feeling fairly unsupported in your abdomen. She did recommend some belly binding, but it wasn't with beautiful, fabulous fabrics. It was kind of a very clinical band thing. But I wanted to look into the research around belly binding to see if there was anything written about it. And unfortunately, I came across, firstly, I couldn't find anything. I searched in the academic literature for belly binding, abdominal binding, wrapping, strapping, all kinds of things, until I stumbled across, here's what if you're academically inclined and you want to find out the research around belly binding, you have to type in the search term dynamic elastomeric fabric orthoses. I'm going to spell that in the show notes for you, but there's a whole practice around fabric wrapping or elastic wraps around various body parts that still allow movement, and they call it dynamic elastometric fabric orthoses. That's the term if you want to read it in the research. Again, I'll put it down there. I'm not going to use it again in this episode, but if you're ever looking for research around belly binding, then that might be something you need to type in if you want to actually find out the academic research. And the other term that came up was relating to Malaysian belly binding, which was called bengkung. Again, I know nothing. Bengkung. See, this is why I had a very clinical look at it. So Sarah's going to talk to us today about what she knows and how she's learnt about belly binding and why we would do that at all.
It's not a very romantic, enticing term, is it? It's like belly binding sounds nice. It's like a hug.
Because essentially it's about wrapping your belly. I mean, people do it in pregnancy, but there's a lot of use of it postnatally. And I've seen it in my practice with clients. Some Asian clients I've seen these beautiful belly wraps and just in awe of how they use them. And they don't think twice. They just go, yeah, that's what you do. That's what you do postnatally. You bind your belly. Tell us, where did you learn about belly binding?
My first exposure was in India as well, where they use the bengkung binding, which is the at least 14-meter long bind, which is a really beautiful one with all the little kind of twists and knots up the center. That one is specifically just for postpartum. I've actually supported a woman who had her appendix out, and because she had an operation and her abdomen was full of air, I also supported her to bind her belly with the bengkung afterwards. But that was my first sort of introduction for hands-on learning. So after the women were bathed and massaged in their postpartum, then we will put their belly bind on and their bengkung binding. So that's also why it's seen in Malaysia, because it's that Ayurvedic practice. I can start though from pregnancy and move on through birth and postpartum, if you like. And even outside pregnancy as well. I have my belly bound right now. It has a lot of physical supportive elements to it. So I'll start outside pregnancy and we'll work our way that way. For whilst you're bleeding, actually just to bring support and warmth to the womb, because the womb is heavier in weight. We get all crampy. We might feel like a heaviness in our pelvis. So what you can do is bind your belly to bring that warmth in. I use some oils underneath, some warming oils, and then that warmth holds the properties of the oils and they penetrate deeper into the abdomen. And I also hold castor oil packs in place with them. So it brings physical support but it also brings like energetic support as well. So in the Mayan culture, you would never expose your belly button because that is an energetic portal that you're taking on or giving energy. So when I'm at a birth or when I'm doing body work or in those big energetic spaces, I'm also binding my belly because it helps, like it feels like that energetic protection, but it also helps bring me back into my body. And from now I bind like quite a lot of women and people, and this is a similar thing that they're telling me. I had someone actually feedback the other day that, you know, she was having actually just a challenging day and she put her belly bind back on and she actually just felt more grounded and centered. So it's very supportive in many different ways. It's a great structural support if you're a body worker like me. It makes you maintain your posture so you're not all slouching, you're protecting your back. And then during pregnancy, I have only seen this working with the Mayan midwives, but they think it's even more important than to protect that energetic portal because they don't want to take in any energy that might impact the baby. But then I've started utilizing it with, you know, those common pregnancy discomforts that come up. So the diastasis rectus, if a woman has abdominal separation, if she's had quite a few babies and her baby is sitting out over the top of her pelvis, or those babies that, like, you know, they're just like kind of flopping around everywhere because the uterus is stretched out and it has a space to do so, and that causes a woman a lot of discomfort. It can help lift the baby. So by lifting the baby, what that helps to do is it's supporting the woman's back because the weight of the baby is closer to the pole of her body. But for women who have like really bad swelling in the lower limbs or vulvar varicosities, hemorrhoids, it creates a space for that fluid actually to be able to come back up. And that structural support of the pelvis as well, that pelvic instability pain and just lower back pain, it can be extremely supportive for that.
Those are the things that the research seemed to suggest using it for. So those real physical ailments where with the abdominal separation, with the malposition of babies, women who've had lots of babies where, you know, you feel around in their tummy and it just feels like there's no barrier of support for the baby. You can just feel all the baby and pelvic pain and the pelvic instability. Those were the things that the research was indicating that these things could be used for. So there's some alignment there.
There are certain circumstances where it can be utilized in birth as well, because obviously it's something that you're putting over the woman's belly that's quite, like, can be quite firm and tight. It's not necessarily the most comfortable thing, but if you have a woman who has a very pendulous abdomen or has had quite a few babies and the baby actually just isn't sitting in the pelvis, you can do like an abdominal lift and tuck where you sort of like tilt the pelvis and lift the baby up and hold it in the pelvis and put like I usually use a rebozo for this, a big wide belly band to hold the baby nice and close to the woman's body, and it actually can help that baby keep that pressure on the cervix then and then for labor to progress. I've spoken with one of my teachers in Guatemala, the one who weaves the fajas, and she says that she puts on a faja when the women are 8 centimeters, and I need to learn more Spanish so I can understand more about her rationale for doing this. But yeah, I'd imagine it's to do with like keeping alignment of the baby during the birth. Obviously it impedes trying to listen to a fetal heart rate if that's something that needs to be done though.
So then postnatally, I mean, are there tutorials online for this kind of stuff? Is it particularly complex? Can women do it themselves?
Yeah, women can absolutely do it themselves. And actually, I've done like quite a few videos. So I have videos like on my Instagram working with the rebozo or working with a faja, but this is also something that I teach more in depth in my circles. So you can just wrap something around the belly and be supportive like that. But if you have a really dynamic understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it, you like for myself and the experience that I have now, because this is a predominant part of the work that I do, I'm tailoring the bind to the needs of the woman. So there are certain things that you can do in order to make it feel more supportive, but you can start with these kind of videos. But I have also done a video for the Bengkung binding with a beautiful brand that I get them from called IBU Ayurveda. So that is on their website, because there are different types of bindings. Obviously, different cultures have different ways of doing it. The three that I predominantly have had exposure and learnt from is the like working with a rebozo, which is a bit of a wider, bulkier like bind to do. I actually I'm wearing one right now. It's just going to be hard for anyone listening, but I've literally just tied it around my waist and that feels like enough for me. But there are like kind of more ways that you can tie it to support the pelvis more or support the sacrum more, or the main intention of why the My Midwives do it is actually to lift the womb and hold the womb in place after birth. So it's going to avoid things like prolapse, because all the ligaments of the uterus have been stretched out, particularly in the ways women are birthing in our culture. Prolapse is like way more common than what it should be. And also they're not resting after they've given birth, but it's intentionally to lift the womb and hold the womb in place. And then again, bring that warmth in. You're supporting the posture while you're breastfeeding, because, those abdominal muscles don't have that strength. So you're bringing in that abdominal support. It's really great for women who do have quite a separation in their abdominal muscles. It will also bring that together. It's keeping the kidneys warm when the kidney energy is low after birth. Again, I'm massaging the belly with really intentional oils that have like really warming properties in them to get the air out of the belly, and then to bring warmth to the uterus. That is, another really supportive part of binding postpartum, is to get that extra air and fluid from the belly, that if you don't get it moving, for a lot of women, it actually ends up just sitting there and staying there. And this is actually something that I also do for women who have had cesareans, in a way that I'm very careful of not irritating and putting too much pressure on the wound. But ultimately, when a woman has had an incision to her abdomen and her uterus has been actually exposed to the air and the cold, those women hold a lot of additional air in their abdomen, and it actually causes a lot of pain. So I get things moving with a bit of a light massage, and then put the bind on, and then it feels really supportive for them. So you just have to do it with like great intention and care, and connection with the woman, and ensuring that it's supportive for her.
For people who are wondering about the idea of air and cold and heat and the importance of that balance, that's a real Ayurvedic philosophy. But in Western medicine, we don't acknowledge that kind of thing. So for people listening going, what are they talking about? Air, the cold, and all these things. In traditional medicine, there's a lot of focus on elements and on heat and on cold and herbs, and how do you manipulate that at certain times. In a lot of cultures and a lot of medicinal modalities, heat is a big part of postpartum repair. And I think too, what we also do in modern medicine and in Western medicine is we just take little elements and then we apply them and hope that they work. But what we're learning, I think, from you is that just belly binding is not really the thing. That it's paired with postpartum care, with massage, with herbs, with some of the cultures are using steam. It's part of a pack. It's not like, just throw a rebozo at it and it'll be fine.
Yeah, partly. I do go with the intention of sharing, like, to make it something that doesn't seem inaccessible, that you don't necessarily have to use these binds and these weavings and these fabrics, which are intentionally designed for them, and I can share a little bit more about. But I always say, just do something. Like, just hug your womb. Whether it's those that like stretchy tubey grip, or I'm not a huge fan of those SR like C shorts, like the really, really tight spandexy shorts, because I'm just like thinking about like bleeding, and they're really challenging to put on, and they're spandexy, and it's not necessarily the most breathable if you have stitches and things like this. But most importantly, it's not about binding and getting up and doing all the normal things that you can like normally do because you've got your bind on, so therefore you're supported. That's not how it works. It's binding and still staying in bed. So I even encourage women to wear the bind while they're in bed as well, because particularly if they're like in bed trying to roll over, if you're trying to lift your baby and roll at the same time and you don't have the engagement of your abdominal muscles, that can be really challenging. So it's something that can even be supportive like while you're laying in bed. It's definitely not as to do so you can therefore do more things. I do feel that any degree of binding is supportive if the woman feels that it is supportive for her, and that's usually always the feedback that I'm getting. But when you are pairing it with other things, of course, your healing is going to be more supported. So I usually at least say, just try and rub some kind of like oil on the womb and just like move a little bit of that air and fluid that's sitting there and bring a little bit of warmth, literally by generating heat. And then putting the bind on is going to be more supportive than not massaging beforehand. But I still think it's one of those things is if you can only manage one thing in your postpartum, let it be belly binding.
So women can use the binding from day one. What's the usual practice around this?
Yeah, I usually do it the day after birth. So, birth is like such a big, like, sort of experience. I know there's some cultures who would literally do it like straight away, but the women that I work with, I usually will do the day after when I see them, because it's part of what I offer. I come and do a massage, and sometimes they just don't feel quite ready for that massage in that super early stage. So then I'll show them how to do it when I give them a massage as well. And there's different ways of binding. So the faja, which is what I've learned in Guatemala, is probably the easiest and the one that women can do on themselves the most easily. The bengkung requires support. You can do it on yourself, but it's actually like quite challenging. So it's usually like a doula. I've had a lot of partners that I've shown how to do it, and they've done it. But what I found when I was initially just working with the bengkung is if women didn't have great support, they weren't doing it, because it was a time consuming process, and you have to like wrap it up in a certain way. So yeah, that's why I'm really resonating now with the faja and the rebozo, because it's a lot more easeful. You can do it on yourself, and I show women how to do it as well, so they can continue that on.
When would you stop binding?
I usually say, like, based on how you're feeling, we can kind of stick to that like 6-week, 40-day postpartum period. I say, if you're feeling really good in your body and you're nearing that time, maybe you just want to wear it just when you leave the house. Or for some women who have like quite a large abdominal separation, I'll even encourage them to do it for like 12 weeks, and then encourage them to do it during their bleed as well. So it's really a practice that, I'm not prescriptive with it. Do what feels good for you and what is manageable for you. I don't want to make it this thing that like, oh, that's too hard, so I'm not going to do it. It's like, just do what works for you.
And how do you feel about the ones, the more westernized ones that are elastic and stretchy and you can Velcro them on? Do you feel like they have a similar action, or is there something lacking in those?
Yeah, I think physically they are kind of a bit universal. They're kind of just this one shaped band that you kind of wrap around yourself, and it's not necessarily giving the opportunity to get under the womb and bring the womb up. And if anything, it might actually just feel like downward pressure, which is not what you want to be feeling. So if you've put a bind on and maybe either it's too tight or it's like too high and it's actually just pushing your pelvic floor down, that's not what you should be feeling. You should be feeling a lift in your pelvic floor. So when I'm binding women, I'm getting them to hold their uterus up, and I'm binding and, doing the bind a little bit tighter under the womb to support the womb. There's one bind that I do a twist in the bind to make like a V shape that then brings in that support around the pelvis and the iliac crest, and then it has a little V that kind of is like where the uterus can sit in. So I find binding with fabric, you're more working to the individual contours of the woman's body, and every time that I'm binding her as the weeks go on, that looks kind of different on her body, because her body is constantly changing in that postpartum period. So I find that working with these fabrics and materials are more individualized to the needs of the body, and a bit more dynamic with what you can do with them. And from an energetic perspective as well. And this is a way that the weaving of a fabric, whether it's a faja or a rebozo, is again a really intentional traditional practice. The way that a weave is done, you can even figure out like where in the country that weave is from, what community, based on the different ties that they do on the ends on the tassels. And that is someone's, life practice is weaving. Even the particular weave, it's a beautiful backstrap style of weaving, and the fajas that I get are extremely tight. She literally weaves one thread at a time by hand, and it takes her a whole week to weave a postpartum faja. So traditionally, the women in Guatemala would weave their own fajas for themselves. It can go beyond just wrapping a piece of fabric around your body. It's also about like, what are you also trying to bring back in? What supports are you bringing back in as well?
So is there any time where you wouldn't wrap a woman?
I feel like the only time, well, first, if the woman doesn't resonate with it and it's not something that feels right for her and her body, but just being cautious around caring for a woman who has had a cesarean. You can protect the wound by putting a maternity pad on that way, but it's quite plasticky and it doesn't allow for the incision to breathe. Particularly if you're then binding, it's going to create a lot of warmth. So I'd really be checking in on keeping that wound clean and dry and giving it some airtime as well. So for women with a cesarean, you might feel that like working with a bind is only like supportive if you're up and moving around and you need that support. Because also remembering that when you've had a cesarean, the abdominal muscles are separated, and there are more layers of the abdomen that have been cut through. So it actually can be extremely supportive, especially those women who feel like they have to like hold themselves before they can even cough or stand up. So a bind in that circumstance can be supportive, but you do want to be checking in, making it too tight and giving the wound time to breathe. The feedback that I've had from one woman who I was teaching about binding, who had previously bound herself after she'd had a cesarean, is that because she couldn't feel the sensation above the wound, she did get like the bind was rubbing on and like irritating the incision. But also this was a circumstance where her baby was in the nursery, so she was up and walking around a lot more than is supportive of your postpartum healing. So that's just something to check in and be aware of. I'd probably completely avoid it if you had a wound infection, because actually that wound needs air and time to heal.
And again, if you've heard anything in the last 3 episodes from Sarah that has piqued your interest, in the show notes of all 3 episodes, you'll see all of her details, information about workshops, where she's going to be if you want to get some training, and excitedly, next year, 2025, Sarah is offering some training in collaboration with the Mayan midwives, where you can learn some of the skills that she knows. Thank you so much for your time, Sarah. We've learned so much that just does not sit in the Western frame at all. And we're grateful for that, because we've gotten way too comfortable in this one single mindset about birth and postpartum. And so we thank you for opening us up to new ways of caring for women postnatally, and ways that women can care for themselves. More importantly, how the community can care for women. Oh, we are going to wrap that up, and we will see you in the next episode of The Great Birth Rebellion.
Thank you for being here for today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. If you want to get access to all the resources that we use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or better still, the Premium Members Hub. The Premium members get access to transcripts, the Ask Mel a Question button, an exclusive Ask Me Anything episode every month. All the details are in the show notes, and I will see you in the next episode of The Great Birth Rebellion.